Hi, everyone. As I said, thank you so much for joining us today for our first members only Lunch Learn of 2024. I want to kick us off by saying thank you not only for being here today, but for being a paying supporter of our newsroom. I'm Elizabeth Hambeacon, the membership and reader revenue strategist for Deep South Today, which serves Mississippi Today and our sister newsroom, Verite News in New Orleans. As you all know, Mississippi Today is a nonprofit newsroom, which means we rely on support from readers like you to make our work possible. Being a nonprofit is very important to us because it means that we get to stay true to our mission of providing free, locally made journalism to our Mississippi friends, neighbors, and family. Your support keeps critical reporting like Jerry Mitchell and team's Pulitzer Prize recognized series, Unfettered Power, in the hands of readers across the country. Thank you. We're in the middle of running our summer member drive, which we're also doubling as Member Appreciation Month. As members, we know that you're all more than just donors. You're some of our most loyal readers as well. That's why we're giving you behind-the-scenes access to our newsroom as a way to show our gratitude. Before I introduce our panelists, I have one quick ask. As members, you all are also some of our greatest advocates. During our summer member drive, which lasts until the end of June, I challenge you each to reach out to one friend or colleague, share with them why you support our newsroom, and ask them to do the same. Even though Mississippi Today is an established 8-year-old newsroom now, it's been built through grassroots efforts like word of mouth and personal outreach. Okay, on to the main event. Let's get started with what you've all come here for today. I'm grateful to have the wonderfully talented Jerry Mitchell and Chris Davis with us. Jerry Mitchell, now an investigative reporter for Mississippi Today, worked for 3 decades at the statewide Clarion Ledger before leaving in 2019 to found the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting. Jerry Mitchell and MCIR joined forces with Mississippi Today last year to continue shining a light through watchdog and investigative reporting. His reporting has had an undeniable impact, including help put 4 Klansmen and a serial killer behind bars, helping free 2 people from death row, and exposing injustices and corruption that led to investigations and reforms, as well as the firings of boards and officials. Welcome, Jerry. Chris Davis, currently the New York Times Local Investigative Reporting Fellowship Deputy, was also an investigative reporter and editor for more than 15 years before overseeing investigative work at USA Today and across Gannett's network of local newsrooms as the network's Vice President of Investigations. Under his guidance, the Arizona Republic conducted a sweeping examination of thousands of copy and paste bills proliferating state houses across the country. A group of Florida reporters revealed how high-profile reforms in the state foster care system actually put kids at risk, and a reporter at the Naples Daily News uncovered modern-day indentured servitude in the trucking industry. We're so glad to have you with us, Chris. This is a quick reminder that this program is being recorded and will be shared out with our audience. Please keep yourself on mute and feel free to drop any questions in the chat as we go along. We'll wrap up the conversation around 20 till so that we have plenty of time to answer all of your questions. Chris and Jerry, over to y'all.
Great, thank you. Jerry, you want me to sort of kick it off?
Sure, go ahead, Chris.
The first thing I want to just say, I probably haven't said this enough to you, Jerry, but it was a real pleasure getting a chance to work with you.
Yeah.
Jerry and I crossed paths first when I was at Gannett and he was at the Clarion Ledger. But we never actually got to work on any stories together. And so it was a real treat to have his crew be part of the fellowship. And, in addition to the great stories that Elizabeth just mentioned, Jerry has done an incredible job of drawing amazing young talent. It just seems like one person after the other who he's drawn to Mississippi, usually from other places, but they all have this sort of sense of mission to come in and do reporting in a place where there isn't a lot of it going on. And you have a lot of legacies, Jerry, when you decide to like hang up your hat, but I think that's a really important one, to continue sort of bringing people in to put eyes on what's going on in Mississippi. So I just want to start with that. I guess I could give just a quick overview of the story. I assume you guys are all pretty familiar with it, but there were a series of really incredible stories that wouldn't have been told, I don't think, if it wasn't for Jerry and Mississippi Today and the crew that jumped into it, about a number of shares. I think it was three shares ultimately got really featured in these investigations for the wrongdoing that they directly were involved in, or oversaw. And in some of these communities, there aren't local papers that are doing this kind of work, at least. There may be some very small local publications, but it was really like one of the things that I'm proudest of is that the reporting took this group of reporters into communities that have really no other option for coverage, and so that was an important piece of this. The stories involved all sorts of wrongdoing, from sort of sexual abuse and broad abuse of power for personal gain to the stuff that you guys, I know, are familiar with about the Goon Squad and the assaults that were going on, for a generation there. Um, but Jerry, the story that when you started working with Alyssa, the story that you guys sort of jumped into was not any of those stories, right? And
That's
I'm
correct.
just curious if you could tell us about the genesis a little bit and sort of how the
Sure.
reporting took you to a different place.
Yeah, well, Alyssa Daly, whom I hired in the summer of 2022, he started off as a summer fellow and then extended her beyond that time. We just started looking at an alleged wrongful conviction case in Clay County, Mississippi, which is West Point, which is, for those who are not familiar with Mississippi, as in most of you are, but it's between, I guess best described between Starkville and Columbus. It's just kind of midway in between those two, that county in between those two. And so we were just looking at a alleged wrongful conviction, basically and we're still following up on this story. We've written a little bit about it, but it's essentially a black mother of four who's in prison for life for a murder that never happened. And but while we were working on the story, we found out the sheriff was allegedly taking women out of the jail and having sex with them, the Clay County Sheriff Eddie Scott. And so that was kind of, what led us into looking at sheriffs. It's like, wow. And the same sheriff in the alleged wrongful conviction case had said it was obvious this guy was shot from 30 feet away when that wasn't the case. It was a close contact wound. So there are all sorts of little things like that led us into him, looking more closely at him. And then while we were digging into him, the allegations of him taking these women out of the jail and having sex with them, we found that the sheriff next door and his deputies were doing the same thing, and even some worse things. Allegations of inmates having the keys to women's male inmates having key to women's cells and going into raping the women. And so that's kind of what led us down the trail of looking more broadly at Mississippi sheriffs, who everybody probably knows, but Mississippi sheriffs are among the most powerful politicians in the state, not just in Mississippi, but other state rural places as well across this country. So.
One of the things that stood out when Jerry and Alyssa came to us and pitched a story on sheriffs in Mississippi, and that I think proved out in virtually every story that they produced, was sort of this idea that people knew about the allegations. In some cases, at least, in many cases, they knew about the allegations and even had gotten, in some cases, investigated in some way, but the public wasn't really aware of it, and nothing had happened to the sheriffs who were investigated, right? Like, talk a little bit about that, Jerry.
Yeah, when we started digging into it, I mean, neither one of these sheriffs, nothing had happened to any of these sheriffs that we were digging into. And while we began asking questions about one case, which there'd been a lawsuit filed on it, but again, and the feds had supposedly investigated, but nothing had happened. And that involved Knoxville County Sheriff. His name is Terry Grassery. And I actually went and spoke to him, and he was, acting like, well, his deputies, he didn't know anything about these deputies doing anything. And, do you have any employees? Do you know everything they do? That was the way he acted about the whole thing. And so after we started asking questions, the feds actually did indict Terry Grassery. In fact, he just pleaded guilty the other day. He's supposed to be sentenced. Although interestingly, and this is unfortunately common, is he wasn't charged with any sexual allegations, nor were the deputies. They were charged with like bribery, and basically his charge he pleaded guilty to the other day was lying to the FBI.
Yeah.
So this is common, unfortunately, in these sexual abuse cases. Even if they have proof of sexual abuse, they often don't charge them with that because they're worried that they'll get away with it, essentially, because unfortunately juries have done that. They go to trial and the law enforcement officer testifies and he winds up being respected and the victim winds up being discredited, and they walk away free. So yeah.
It's a good reminder. So the prosecutors and investigators who are in a position to look at these play by a whole different set of rules than a media outlet does, and
Yep.
there's a lot of pluses to
they
that.
they do.
But there's a lot of minuses too, right? And so it's kind of a reminder of why it's good to have someone like Jerry Mitchell and Melissa Daly and others looking on top of what the federal authorities can do or the state authorities can do.
Yeah. And there are a lot of things we wrote about that obviously were not charged. And Terry Grassery was allegedly beating people, not just like suspects, but also people for political retribution, essentially. Those are the allegations.
Yeah. So one of the big differences between what the FBI or whoever can do and what you guys can do is we can't force people to into interviews. We can't subpoena records.
Yeah.
You guys were relying really heavily on victims, people who had been hurt and were in positions of danger, really, right? And yet you got a lot of them in all these cases to talk pretty in depth about what had happened to them. How did the reporters and how did you guys do that?
Yeah. Well, I think our reporters did an excellent job of that. Alyssa Daly was dealing directly with the women that were victimized in these cases. The initial cases that we dealt with, allegations of, again, these women being taken out of jail and being sexually abused. And it's just a process. It's an important process that you have to kind of go through. Obviously there was great risk to them. And most of the people that we talked to, victims and of course Goon Squad victims as well, actually went on the record. And that was really kind of surprising to me, to be honest, Chris, because these people could be arrested again or prosecuted, or no, in the case of the young woman that we talked to the most, Amber Jones, in the Clay County case, she had already been retaliated against, allegedly. I mean, she had been arrested twice on drug cases, and then we got a hold of an audio tape. It would just be her word, obviously, against law enforcement, against evidence being planted, but we actually got a hold of an audio tape in which this alleged drug dealer, according to the sheriff's office, he's a major drug dealer, basically talked on audio about how, oh yeah, I planted those drugs in her car, which was wild. But anyway, I think our reporters did an excellent job of really getting these victims to cooperate, which was an immense task. I mean, just really reassured them over time and built up our trust, the trust that they had with us. So.
Yeah. I remember being sort of stunned by what people were willing to tell the reporters too. And I don't know that there's any one thing that makes that work, but I do think that all of the reporters, and Jerry really led them through this, were intentionally like went to these people that had these stories and met them,
Yeah.
um, on a personal level in their own homes.
Yes, I think that's helpful.
Yeah, and made them
Got to
feel,
know them really, Chris. I mean,
yeah,
Amber, we spent a tremendous amount of time with, and really lived in these communities to a certain extent, West Point and the other communities.
yeah, places that most people don't probably never go, and
Yeah,
even
no, I
reporters
agree.
don't do
West
that.
Point is not the place people would
Yeah,
normally.
yeah. Um, so I've heard you say that that what makes a good reporter isn't necessarily talent; it's persistence.
Yeah, I think that's
Um,
true.
what? How did they show that in this? Where did persistence play a
But,
big part?
I can't help but think of Alyssa and the Sheriff Eddie Scott case we've been talking about in Clay County. Um, stayed after this, there were allegations about this that we had heard about, and this young woman on Facebook actually had said, "Hey, you did the same thing to me, and I got proof," but then wouldn't talk to us. And so we eventually found a case that she was mentioning. It wasn't online. We have electronic court system. So we went there, and literally every file up until that court file, was there. And every file after that file was there. So we were just like, what's going on? It's a missing court file, which normally never happens. And the fact that it was, her name on it was more than a little suspicious.
Her
So
name and against the sitting sheriff.
yeah. Well, we didn't know. It just was a
I see.
post-conviction. At this point, all we knew was post-conviction relief. That's all we knew. That's all that's all it said online in electronic courts, was it was post-conviction relief. We had heard, and like I said, we saw this Facebook comment. So, you know, anyway, Alyssa talked to this assistant clerk, and essentially, I always say what you have to do a lot of times is turn people into allies. As you're working with people and you're talking to people, ideally they become your allies. And so she searched high and low for this file and literally found it in another file cabinet. It had obviously been deep sixed, and found the file, and then when we visited again, they had the file suddenly, and now we saw, Alyssa and I looked at it and saw the record, which basically showed that there was these love letters that the sheriff wrote this woman in prison that he had been having sex with. So we essentially had proof.
Yeah.
Kind of had a smoking gun, which
Yeah, it became the lead of the story, and a really important find, I think, because so much of this winds up being he said, she said,
right.
and you really had at that point one woman who was on the record talking about what had happened, and this was sort of a second voice saying this happened to me too, right?
Exactly. And it was really proof. I mean, it's because it was in his own handwriting. He admitted he wrote the letters. And so it wasn't like any level of denial. In fact, he even had the letters. He was actually used the PO box of the sheriff's department for the letters. Unreal. It's like he's talking about how worked up he is, you know. Can't wait to have sex with her again.
Yeah, it was kind of
And they were
cool.
having sex in his patrol car it was like, this is a horrible detail, but he was having sex in a patrol car with her at a pig farm. It's just like, really?
Yeah.
Unreal.
Yeah. There was a lot of like moments where it all seemed unreal around that story. I
Yeah, yeah.
remember. So another like anecdote that comes to mind is when Brian and Nate, they're the two guys who work primarily in the Goon Squad
Yep.
story, were going into places like Robin Hood and different communities where folks have been targeted, and a lot of these folks are living in, squalid conditions, and they're surrounded
Yep.
by um, crime, particularly drug crime. But um, in one case, um, Brian, I think it was trying to talk to someone, and there's a moment where he pulls out his gun.
Yeah, there's like a drug deal, uh, which Brian didn't realize, but there was apparently a drug deal going down at the same time. And so their guns get pulled out. Brian's freaking out. Brian actually pulled money out of his own wallet. So, because there was a dispute over money. And Brian said, here's the money, basically whatever the dispute amount was. I can't remember the exact amount that was being disputed. And Brian just threw the money down and got out of there. Yeah. So yeah, this is the thing people don't realize sometimes. I mean, investigative reporting, it can lead you to some of these kinds of places, but yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about how the reporters made themselves as safe as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think we tried to be safe. Early on, we wound up using Signal, which is kind of a safe, because we had some allegations that the sheriff was tapping phones and things like that, the sheriff's office we ended up switching over to Signal and using talking talking through Signal, which is encrypted, and message through Signal, and then we were also, letting, like, if Brian Howie left and he was going to a particular place, he would let Nate Rosenfeld know, that he was going, and et cetera, and me too, and if I was around, and so those kind of things, we basically had each other's backs, for lack of a better term. And then, like, I'm leaving, I got here, I'm safe, I'm leaving, I'm safe, all that kind of stuff. That we signaled each other just to make sure that everybody was safe.
Yeah. So I'm going to switch tracks a little bit here
Sure.
and move over to like the Goon Squad. When Jerry and Alyssa started their reporting and they pitched the sheriff story sort of broadly to our fellowship program, they weren't focused on Rankin County at all, and we were very happy to work on the Clay County and Noxubee County stories. Uh, but news events happened and sort of opened the door to an even deeper partnership. You want to talk a little bit about how the Goon Squad story started?
Yeah, yeah. So hired Brian and Nate in the summer. They were both kind of summer fellows for 2023, and began working, looking at the Rankin County Sheriff's Department. We already knew some allegations about the Sheriff's Department. I was aware of allegations that, and Alyssa and I did this story about how the sheriff was using grand jury subpoenas to spy on his married girlfriend and stuff like that. And I was aware of that already. And then I was also aware of allegations that the number of Black men had died at the hands, either died in custody, I guess is more accurate, died in custody of Rankin County Sheriff's Department. So very curious about that. And so they actually started off digging into that pretty early on. And then about mid-June, I guess it was, I had a conversation with a source you know, because I was like, they started finding out stuff about the Rankin County Sheriff's Department. So I called a law enforcement source of mine, and he pointed me to this guy named Rick Lovejoy, and he was the one, the kind of one of the early ones that helped break open, you know, the Goon Squad stuff for us, because he was a law enforcement officer in Hinds County, and he had been tortured and etc. And so it was pretty, you know, that was what kind of helped break open. And the guys, you know, Brian and Nate just did an excellent job, I think, and tracking people down. They literally started with that case, and then that case led to another case and another case and another case and another case. So like they would, each person they would talk to, do you know any other cases? You know, anybody else we need to talk to? And literally pieced it together like that, which I thought was much better than if you just put up like an ad, you know, on Facebook or, you know, social media and said, hey, we want Goon Squad victims, you know.
Right.
And in fact, when they started this, that name Goon Squad wasn't even known. You know, when we started this reporting, we just started hearing these allegations of torture. We were aware of two Black men who had been tortured, but what we didn't know was this was happening to, you know, others. And so they started that reporting, spent about 6 months working on that, and documented, as Chris already mentioned, basically this torture had been going on for a generation. Yeah.
Yeah. It might be helpful for me just to explain a little bit about how the fellowship works. You know, the time started this, it's been close to 2 years ago. Dean Baquet, the former editor at the Times, reached 65, and the Times rules say you have to come off the masthead at that point. And so he didn't want to retire, and I think the publisher was looking for a way to keep him at the paper involved in something that was a passion project, and he really wanted to do something around you know, local news. And
Right.
so they came up with this program that brings in local reporters that are already working in their communities, gives them a year as a Times employee, just like any other Times employee, to work on an investigative series of stories. And they work with the editors, myself and others, Dean, in the program. And then the idea is that if they have a home newsroom like Mississippi Today or MCIR, those stories are available to be run in those publications, but also they run in the Times, right? And so with Jerry's a little bit different because Jerry was also reporting, so it was more of a partnership, I think. And then
Right.
when Nate and Brian came along, there was sort of this discussion of, is this all part of one project, and do we
Right.
want to work in unison on that as well? And we decided, yes, we wanted to support it in any way we could. So the Times role in that was mostly to, you know, me editing and working with Jerry to sort of pull off the stories. But we did help sort of a little bit financially too to
Yeah,
extend, I
you
think, the
did.
time of
You
Brian and
guys
Megan.
helped pay their salaries
And
last year.
yeah, and
And
then
Alyssa became a fellow. She was a fellow in 2023, and then this year Nate and Brian are fellows. So
yeah. Yeah, so we all decided it would be great for them to continue reporting, even though that fellowship period, the original fellowship period, was over. And so we offered them both full-time fellowships as part of the program, so they could keep digging in Rankin County and in Mississippi in general. So that continues today.
yep.
Um, so uh, I remember, we could talk a little bit about the process. Hopefully it'll be interesting, but I remember one of the big questions when Brian and Nate were really getting all this information
Right.
about people who were being tortured, and, you know, this deputy did that, and the other deputy did this, um, and most of it wasn't backed up in records in a way that
Right.
traditionally we would be very comfortable publishing, right? So if it's in an investigative report or a lawsuit, we have a lot of protections and it's
Right,
easier for us
exactly.
to publish information. When it's someone's allegation, it gets difficult because one word against someone else, and if they're making it up, we're just as liable as the person who said it. And so, we have to be very careful and persistent about trying to confirm aspects of the story. So we had all these folks who said that they were brutalized, and we believed them, obviously. But we felt like it wasn't enough just to have one person's allegations. So can you talk a little bit about the ways that they were
Sure.
able to confirm and how difficult some of
Yeah,
that
yeah,
was?
yeah. And you can talk about that too, about kind of the process on that real quick. So one of the things, I'll just jump to so you obviously had jail booking photos. That's one of the things we got, and we were kind of shocked is we probably had a half dozen or more that were easily confirmed just by the booking photo. I mean, you could tell these guys had been just brutalized.
And
They
and
still
and
had
those and
good.
those injuries weren't necessarily explained away in the report, right?
Yeah, it may not, in the report, it might just say, oh, it was all, very kind and wonderful, and we arrested this guy, and no mention of uh he resisted arrest or, some kind of other way that would, you know, seem to explain the injuries. There was no explanation of injuries. Uh, in terms of, I'm skipping ahead, but taser use, they would talk about taser use, but then we would go to the incident report and they would talk about they've been tortured, tasered, tortured. But then you get over to the incident report and there's nothing, there's nothing. You're supposed to write down to use the taser, and they didn't. There was
Yeah.
nothing there. So now you just have one word, one person's word against another, and that's problematic for us. What do we do with that? And then so Nate and Brian basically started off just getting records on particular deputies, but eventually got all the taser logs. And essentially every time a taser is fired, um, it has like a computer built into it essentially that records how, when it's fired, how long it's fired for, da 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 da. And there are guidelines for the way you should be using tasers as well. And what we found is they completely violated, use of tasers. We worked with the Times put us in touch with Big Local, and I guess you can talk about that more, but essentially developed an algorithm for analyzing taser use as well. And I mean, it was a pretty involved process that wound up being unique and that I'd never seen, I don't know of it ever being used before. Do you, Chris,
Yeah,
of
no, I mean,
taser logs?
Dina's like to say that they found a new way of like confirming police misconduct. I think that's right, right? It really allowed us to, if someone was alleging they got tased and there was no other explanation for it in the records police produced,
Right,
we could go see that the log backed up what these people were
exactly.
alleging. We counted that. We put great weight on that, right? It's like a confirmation of the story that they were telling, that really is not disputable, because
Right,
the logs were capturing it. And sometimes it wasn't just like they tased once or twice while they were chasing somebody. These
right,
people
exactly.
were tied down or held down at gunpoint, and then there would be 6, 8, 10 taser pulls where they were just shocking them. And you
And
could sort of tell that from
from the
from the
logs, because they're
logs.
only supposed to do it for like 5 seconds. And
Yeah.
instead it would be this whole continuing use of the taser beyond what the manufacturer suggests, recommends. Um, but yeah, so we had that, we had hospital records that we were able to get, obviously we had to get people's permission to get their hospital records. Um, all that, a lot of investigative reporting essentially to try to document this. And Chris can talk about this, but really Brian and Nate did an excellent job in creating a memo. It was kind of a living, breathing memo that over time, you know, modified as the reporting, more and more reporting was brought to bear, maybe what the allegation was initially. And then, okay, we've got these hospital reports. Oh, we've got a taser log that shows this guy was indeed, tasered, despite the fact the incident report doesn't mention it, and so obviously they're trying to conceal it. And, but yeah, had witnesses, obviously track down witnesses, maybe secondary witnesses, complaints, maybe someone they told about at the time. All those things were put into this memo, and you can talk, Chris, if you want to, about
Yeah, sure. This is the part they don't show this in the movies about journalism investigations, right? Because it's kind of the boring but necessary work. And so the reporting team really was tracking all of these details about every single case, and there were 20 or 30 I think cases in the end that we reviewed, and they were having to sort of seek out and record all these different things that we wanted to try to do to confirm their stories. And Jerry just mentioned them, the pictures, for example, of them being beaten up that were taken when they were booked into the jail, or the taser logs became a really important part of that. And then we sat down. I mean, probably several meetings that lasted an hour or two each, and literally sort of talked through each of these cases to prosecute whether we had enough to feel comfortable publishing. Do we have multiple witnesses and some other form of corroboration? I think we decided we wanted sort of three ways to corroborate the story of a victim. A lot of cases that there were other people who were there and witnessed something at least, right? And in other cases, there was the taser. That was a really important one in the end, the taser logs. We had a few that filed complaints that sort of helped back up what they said, and some had medical records, but it was really a tedious process. And we didn't include any cases, even in our counts. Like, we found X number of cases of alleged brutality. We didn't count ones that we didn't have those kind of minimum corroborating pieces of information on. So we felt bulletproof, and we haven't had any, challenge. Maybe that's
nobody's challenged. No one's challenged a single word of it, to my knowledge. Yeah, but it was a tedious process, but necessary process that we kind of went through, and we were, hey, can we show this or whatever? I think we had like 40 something allegations, if I recall correctly, in the memo, but we didn't have everything confirmed. It's just like, these are people we talked to, and I had them confirmed at various levels. Maybe we had 1 or 2 verifications, but we didn't have 3, that kind of thing. So
we're getting, I think, close to the time where we want to see if you guys have questions. But one thing I want to make sure we hit is the impact of the series.
Yeah, the impact, I think, is important. I mean, as I always think about, Chris, you got to have the truth before you have justice, and I think that's so important. But the other part of that as well is the public needs to know. I mean, we had a session, Mississippi Day had a session with Atlantic Magazine back in, it was late November, if I recall correctly. And I'll never forget, there was a woman there who attended our session where we're talking about this, and the story had just come out about the Goon Squad, and got up and said, basically thanked us for the reporting that we had done, on the sheriffs and specifically on Rankin County. But she says, like, we're talking about this. We needed to know this, and that's what's needed. I mean, because the public, if the public's in the dark and they don't know these things are happening, like the Goon Squad, I mean, you have no idea that essentially you have this rogue group that's going around and torturing people. And we can debate whether the sheriff is telling the truth when he says he knew nothing about this or not, but but it's had an impact. The state law, we had a state law that was passed, essentially giving the board certification board the authority to take away someone's certification, and now they can have an investigator on board, or a pair of investigators that they didn't have before. Whereas before they just kind of were whatever's set in front of them kind of situation. So I think it's already, and I think it's going to continue to lead to some additional things like the Goon Squad itself. I'm pretty confident that there's probably going to be some other things in the wake of this.
Yeah. All right, great. Do we want to
Yeah, you said you wanted
questions?
to open it up for questions, so we're happy to answer any questions.
Yes, for sure. We already have one question in the chat from earlier that I'll read out. Carol is asking if there's any chance these cases could be prosecuted by judge instead of jury, and if that would be easier to convict.
I think you have to waive, if you're a defendant, you would have to waive your right to a jury in order to be tried by a judge. I mean, there's not a means, so that's not necessarily, that's just kind of how that works. And the Constitution guarantees us a right to trial by jury.
I think that's right. It's interesting. It's interesting, just sort of thought about whether it would make a difference. I don't know, and I don't want to disparage judges in general down there. I will say that in the reporting that Jerry and his team did, there were a number of instances where judges were looking the other way, or even more than that. It's at least it seems, and so I don't.
There are people who are injured. These people that are obviously beaten up, and they show up in the courtroom. I mean, you've got to know there's injuries. There's no way you wouldn't know.
Yeah, there was a lot of in various different ways information known to judges around some of these allegations, and
yeah, well, they were informed
really
about the grand jury subpoenas. We know that.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. Maybe that would help, but I do wonder how much it would help.
Thanks, Al. Feel free to keep dropping questions in the chat. I actually have one while we have a second. So y'all spoke a little bit about the fellowship and how that's kind of got its start. I'm wondering if, I think we saw pretty much overwhelming support for this reporting. The kind of like response to it was pretty big, but of course there are always like a couple of critics out there that, say, what does the New York Times know about Mississippi, or what does this nonprofit newsroom in Mississippi know about a national audience? And so I'm wondering if the two of you could kind of speak to how these partnerships strengthen both of those things, and what, the New York Times decision to create this local fellowship and the impact you've seen of that, not just in Mississippi, but kind of in investigative work generally.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on it there. The way we benefit from this is that Jerry Mitchell is a big part of the project, right? And he has that long local experience that most, at least editors at the time, don't have. I mean, the New York Times has reporters based in communities around the country too, covering issues, but certainly that's been a knock on the Times and all the sort of coastal national media. It's a hard thing to do. If you're not there, you don't understand it. You didn't grow up in those places. You don't fully understand almost anything about it. And I think that's part of the beauty of the fellowship is that we have ties to the local media outlets, and we have people who are living in those places. I mean, to varying degrees, right? Because a lot of folks in journalism in general are kind of moving around. They don't necessarily work in the hometown where they grew up. But it's nice to have someone like Jerry, or at least people who are on the ground and developing sources in the places that we're writing about. I think I mean, you guys, Jerry, maybe you could speak better to this, but I do think there's value to the local, um, both community and the local newsroom to the New York Times
Oh,
weighing in on a story, right? Because it brings
yeah,
attention in a way that you really can't get if it only runs in a local market. I have
yeah.
no idea what was going through the minds of people who reacted to the stories like in positions of power, but it certainly doesn't hurt that the Times exerted its
No, no, it was
pressure.
very helpful. In fact, interestingly, some of the stories we did, I believe, were among the top read stories on the New York Times website, which obviously brought a lot more attention to these cases that wouldn't have had this. In fact, after we did the story on Eddie Scott, the Clay County sheriff, he held like a news conference, to which I don't know that he would have if it had just been reported locally. You know what I mean? He would have just ignored us, but
You
yeah,
know, oh, sorry, Jerry.
yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I was gonna say one more thing. The other thing, at least about the fellowship, is that we generally aren't partnering only with one local newsroom. We're making it available to a number of local newsrooms, and Mississippi Today was a supporter of that. I think that's part of their DNA, right? But so virtually all the stories we did in Mississippi on this topic and others also ran in the Jackson Advocate, which is the black paper in town. We sought out. I don't remember. I'm not going to remember the names of them, but there were really small
I,
outlets in some of the neighboring counties where this was.
yeah,
Happening.
they ran the local,
Yeah,
communities. A lot of them, a number of them ran the
yeah,
stories, and we got an editorial. I'll never forget this, or column, in the Columbus Dispatch, which basically thanked us for doing the reporting because they couldn't do that kind of reporting anymore.
yeah.
Essentially, they didn't have the manpower, which I thought was interesting. So it shows the value and of course, we couldn't have done it without the New York Times. I mean, like, for example, the working with Big Local, analyzing taser logs. This is not anything I understand. I'll be the first to confess that. In terms of algorithms and all this other kind of stuff, it's like, yeah, that's out of my. I don't understand any of that. But so grateful to have worked with Chris, to work with Dean. It's just been, at least I think, just a terrific partnership, working together on this, and very grateful. Yeah.
Thanks. We have a couple more questions come in. Ron John did ask if we have any comments on the Bo Bryant case that the newsroom has appealed. I'm going to say not today, but if you're curious, our editor-in-chief, Adam Show did have a op-ed appear in the New York Times this morning. So I would encourage you to look there if you're curious for more information. Christina has asked, have either of you, Chris or Jerry, ever been intimidated or retaliated by the government when reporting these stories?
Well, one of the sheriff's buddies in Clay County reached out to me at one point, but he was just trying to intimidate me, and it was really kind of cracking me up because it's like, you know, I've been threatened by Klansmen, so it's like you're gonna have to try harder. Anyway, but yeah, anytime you do investigative reporting, and Chris can tell you this, you're gonna get people are gonna try to keep you from doing it, or intimidate you, or bully you, or whatever, into not doing stories.
There's I don't Jerry knows way more about this particular case, but just sort of broadly, I do think there's um more of a willingness by people in government to aggressively sort of call out or dox. You guys know what that term means. I don't know if that's made it into everybody's lexicon or not, but like, try to embarrass them online or encourage people to harass them online and that kind of thing that didn't exist when I was a reporter.
Yeah.
I never had something like that happen, and now in certain places across the country, I think that's sort of a standard. There's an attack dog sort of response when there's an investigative piece that gets published, and the professional public relations people who have been hired by the governor or whatever agency feel like their playbook now includes personal attacks, calling people idiots and saying that they're fake news and what everything else you can imagine. And I do think that's a new thing that's terrible in a lot of different ways. But in my view, like absolutely out of bounds for our government to be doing.
Thanks. We have a 3-part question here from Dennis. He said, thanks for doing this and congratulations on the Pulitzer Prize recognition. The first part is something changing in Clay and Noxubee counties. Is there any reason to think the same thing is not happening in the other 79 counties, given what you found? And what can people like Dennis do to help?
Well, are things changing in Clay and Noxubee? Yes. I mean, there was like a real sentiment of, especially in Clay, I'd say, in terms of people who were upset with what was happening, that knew about this and were upset about what was happening. It wasn't really quote unquote out there publicly, but everybody knew it's a small town. And so they're grateful, and we'll see what happens over time. I know Amber's in a better place now. Heard from her not too long ago. And she has a new baby, and so she's a mama now. She's very excited. And so I think there's just something very powerful about the truth. It really is. There's just something very powerful about it. And then about the other 79 counties, we're looking at them.
That's a good tease, Jerry. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but we do still have 2 fantastic reporters, plus whatever time Jerry can devote to it, looking into the state and very similar themes. We're not far enough along at this point to know, because we've been really focused the first half of the year on Rankin County. But I would say stay tuned, and we are thinking the same. We're asking the same question.
Yeah, and then in terms of what you can do to help, obviously, we appreciate any support you give for investigative reporting, like what we're doing, and grateful again to the Times. They, like I said, it's basically all 3 of the reporters that we've worked with have been fellows with the Times, as well as additional financial support from the Times. So we appreciate that for this project.
We have another question from Ranjan. How was the grand jury process used to tail the sheriff's wife?
Oh, so that was the story I was referring to. I'll try to find the link for it. Essentially, the Rankin County Sheriff was using a grand jury to spy on his married girlfriend. And we were able to get the documents on that, which documented that that's what he was doing. He was essentially trying to find out, bluntly, he was trying to find out if, quote unquote, his girlfriend was, quote unquote, cheating on him. I don't mean cheating necessarily sexually, but talking to another guy.
The process he used was he was able to write up a personal request, essentially, of the person who kind of managed the grand jury, and say, hey, this guy is under investigation. It's secret. I can't tell you what it's about, but I need his phone records, and I need the grand jury to give me the subpoena to get him. And so there was really no screening of that process. It was very transactional, and so they would just go, okay, And turns out, obviously, that there was no legitimate investigation into this guy. It was
No.
just him trying to find out if he was on the phone with a woman.
Yeah, exactly. So I just put the link to that story.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. This one's from Brianna. I think it's for you, Jerry. Is there any renewed interest in your investigations in light of this being the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer? I was hoping this would be a significant anniversary.
Yeah, well, there are going to be some events in Neshoba County. There's actually one tonight at the Ellis, I believe, in Philadelphia, and then the church, Mount Zion Methodist Church, is having a service. I know I'm going over for that. That's at 3 o'clock on Sunday. So yeah, I mean the continued. I mean, there's no one, to my knowledge, that's still alive that's a suspect in that case, but certainly still interested in that case. And I know Mississippi Today is, I think, there's actually, they're putting up a historical sign where the jail was today. And I know Mississippi Today is doing a story on that as well. So we're continuing to write about that. And for those who have any interest, every day in Mississippi Today, we have an On This Day feature, which kind of features some of this type of history, if you're interested.
Thank you. I know we have 2 minutes left, so I'll ask one final question. I know I was so fortunate to be in the newsroom when the Pulitzer Prize recognition was announced, and we had the New York Times live stream on One TV too, watching them receive the news as well. And I know, Jerry, you said that this work is far from over. Always more to be done, not only in Mississippi, but across the country as well. And so I'm wondering if both of you, in the 1 minute we have left, can leave us with some thoughts about the future of investigative journalism and the need for it kind of across the world.
I just think it's critical. I heard a quote the other day that I thought was so good. It was just basically how that, investigative reporting is essentially kind of the lifeblood of democracy, and how we have to have this in order to combat disinformation, which we're having right now at unprecedented levels, because of social media, because of websites, other kind of things that people are sharing disinformation. And so that's why it's important that the truth be known. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to dig at and get the truth, so people can know and people can be an informed democracy. Because the last thing we want is something that's non-informed. I know I just got done reading a book called Unfathomable Ascent, which was about how Hitler took power. And he really benefited from this sort of thing, disinformation and other things like that. So it was just a historical reminder of and how he kind of began to kind of take control in one way or another through influence or otherwise of the press. So it's very fascinating. And history is always a really good teacher, I think, and sometimes we forget that. And but I think what we do is it's tremendously important. And that's it. To you, Chris.
I would just piggyback on that. I think all forms of independent journalism are as or more important right now than they've ever been. They're under attack from a number of different places. And I think that local journalism is particularly important in this, in part because it remains more trusted in general than the national media. So I think it can get through to people in ways that the New York Times probably can't. which is sad, but I think that's been true for a long time. And I came up in local newsrooms, and there were always surveys and things that showed that's the case. The people trust their local paper more than they trust an outside paper. So both those things, independent journalism and local news, are not in great shape, and are really important as we're dealing with all the issues that are in front of us right now.
Great. Thank you both again for being here with us. I think this was a really important conversation today, and thank you to all our members for being here too and spending your lunch hour with us. We are have lots of member programming like this in the works for the rest of the year. So be on the lookout in your email inbox for announcements about that. I know we're 2 minutes over, so we'll head on out, but just a quick poll from the audience. If this helped you feel closer to our newsroom today, I'd love to see a thumbs up in the chat. And then, of course, we're always open to feedback too, if you know what you want to see in future programs like this. So thank you again, everybody, and I hope everybody has a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Right. Appreciate it.
See you, Jerry.